Hi everyone. Thanks for that introduction. I don't think I need to say much more about myself. So, as was said, CLIMAVORE is an organisation that looks at how we eat as humans change the climate. And it was established by my colleagues' cooking sections in the Isle of Skye and Rosa in 2016 in the Scottish Inner Hebrides. So our work looks at how food organises the environment quite broadly across a range of projects. And in the Isle of Skye and Rosa, we look into salmon farming and alternatives to that. So the islands are home to around 2 million farmed salmon that are all farmed in these open net fish farms, and around 10,000 people. And for decades, residents of the island have fought open net salmon farms because of their cascading impacts on human and non-human bodies across the coasts. Now, CLIMAVORE aims to develop strategies to divest away from salmon farming through a range of techniques and tactics. This is broadly to refuse the short-termism that has made certain coastal regions, like the Isle of Skye, sacrifice zones to continue feeding the world with farmed fish. And we question how we can cultivate modes of tidal commoning, collective ownership, alternative ingredients, and alternative economies that move beyond destructive industries like the salmon farming industry. And so as an organisation, our work loops around 3 pillars: regrowing, rebuilding, and relearning. So I'm here to talk about rebuilding and talking about the seashell tiles, but all of these things kind of feed into each other. So in regrowing, we try and pilot, and we're trying to establish community-managed intertidal growing areas in different coastal regions in the Isle of Skye with community groups and people that we work with, and we call these sea orchards. And the idea is that they're kind of walkable, accessible growing areas on the coast that you can access by foot, and they grow like a range of intertidal ingredients that filter the water as they grow. And this is one of our pilot schemes. In relearning, so over the past 7 years since we've established CLIMAVORE, we've done a number of kind of workshops, cooking apprenticeships, and community workshops and gathering seaweeds and all of this stuff. But a big part of that is that we've worked with restaurants on the island to remove salmon from their menus. And to get them to agree to remove salmon, it's also been to get them to agree to include alternatives. And those alternatives are ingredients that filter the water as they grow and that like actively kind of process the environment around them and contribute to improving biodiversity. And so that's things like seaweeds, sea vegetables, and bivalves. Bivalves being clams, oysters, scallops, any shellfish really that they want to sell and people want to eat. And so as the restaurants were selling a lot more shellfish feasts, as they were becoming CLIMAVORE, they also were collecting a lot more shellfish wastes, as you can see in this big pile of shells. And this is like what led towards the rebuilding arm of our organisation, which has started to revolve around how we can make building materials out of waste seashells, and how we can build production facilities around that on the islands and work directly with the restaurants to collect their shells and make materials out of them. And this is broadly because the project takes a metabolic view of the built environment across the tidal regions and high tide and low tide, from construction to excretion and waste cycles and waste loops. And so we wanted to think about how these waste cycles could kind of feed into some of our other ideas and dreams on the island. And so whilst we started to collect shells and start massing up those piles of the waste shells on the Isle of Skye, we also worked on a number of artistic installations and commissions to develop the waste material. So this installation here was on Muscle Beach in LA, which we renamed as Muscle Beach for the duration of this installation. And we made this series of panels that were made out of cement and waste mussel shells, and they kind of depicted the different ways that mussels can interact with our mussels and our bodies, and also the coasts and the histories of the coasts throughout LA. We then started to think more and more about how shells might have been used as building materials, and they have been across coastal regions for like a very long time, for millennia. They're a very useful material. They're made out of calcium carbonate, and that's also what makes our rocks and mountains and our bones. So this example is tabby cement, and you find a lot of this in New Orleans, and we started working with fabricators to kind of relearn these methods, and we made these tables out of the similar technique. And you make tabby concrete by burning shells, and that makes a kind of binder, and then you mix them with crushed shells. And this table was part of a performance called Oyster Readings, where you could go and sit at the table and talk to a performer and get the kind of your future read to you through the oyster and through eating the oyster and through the patterns on the shells, which also tell you a history of the coasts and the different activities that have happened on them. So we continue to find lots of stories of how shells had made our built environment and become integrated with them in coastal regions. Another one is like them slightly thin to create windows, like this example in Roxas City in the Philippines. And in the UK, where I'm based, there's many, many examples. Lots of medieval castles, actually. Now people have kind of studied the mortar that was used to hold the bricks and the stones together, like Corfe Castle here in Dorset. And it's seashell lime that makes the mortar, and so that's another case of seashells burnt to produce a kind of binding material. And that's what holds a lot of the medieval forts, churches, and castles across the coastal region of the UK, like you can see here. And in Edinburgh, we found lots of examples as well, because Edinburgh historically has had loads and loads of oyster fisheries and access to oysters, and they're a really common food for Scottish people and people in Edinburgh, like an excellent marine protein that was very, very cheap until they became exhausted and they were no longer cheap. And this is an example in the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, where oysters have kind of been used to fill a hole in the 15th century when it was built, but this was only kind of found a few years ago. And so seashell lime and lime mortar has definitely been part of coastal built environments for a very long time. That's become very clear. But they're one of many architectural typologies that no longer commonly exist. And this is kind of like, there's a lot of architectural typologies that historically would have really connected to our food cultures and connected to agricultures and kind of depended on them and used them to build our architectures. And partly these don't exist because carbon-intensive materials like cement have taken their place, which has kind of separated this historic relationship between food, architectures, and coasts. And it's also because varying forms of intensive food production, be it salmon farming or otherwise, are annihilating the knowledge, ecologies, and materials needed to make these architectures because of their dominance across the coast and their destructive nature. So through this project, we're interested to think about how to support alternatives in foods and ingredients and meals and materials simultaneously, and how both the development of both together can kind of feed each other and nourish each other. Okay, so back to the Isle of Skye in 2019, we were collecting all these shells, and through all of these kind of different projects that we were doing across the world and people that we were talking to, we started kind of using some of these techniques and started crushing the shells, cleaning the shells. We've kind of set up this shell collection surface, almost like another like bin collection service, but they have a bin for their shells, and we have members of our team that go and collect them and bring them to our shell midden where they're cleaned. We've kind of worked out this process of making seashell lime with our workshop director, Joel Franklin, who has like a expertise in kind of historic building conservation and like lime within that. And so he's kind of learned a lot and taught us a lot about how to make lime and make it kind of really strong and successful and make it out of like 100% seashells, which is not commonly done anymore, as I said. So our first large-scale like kind of demonstration of this was in the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. And this was a 400 tile installation, and the kind of like scale up of production from smaller scale tables towards this larger room scale allowed us to learn a lot more about the material and what was possible, and the kind of like aesthetics around it and how we could make it and what would be involved. But it also made us question a lot about like what we were doing by using a waste material, because working with waste materials and waste foods, whilst it's important to kind of develop these knowledges, there's also a kind of huge critique around circularity that we've been circulating ourselves around as well, and that like is important to take note of. Because circularity, or like when people talk about circular economies, they kind of imply a closed loop, like you use the waste and then the waste is grounded and it's fixed in one place. But waste materials are a matter that's like always on the move, and as many leaky industries have taught us, you can never really pin down waste entirely, and it will continue to like make its way through us and our bodies and the environment. And also another thing that is kind of important to consider is that excessive waste, when like waste builds up and there's a huge kind of material opportunity, is also one of multiple results of kind of neoliberal land management and huge extractive practices, because far too much is being produced from specific geographies. And recycling as an idea even, it's not like a new idea that's emerged within the kind of last 20 years of Western environmental consciousness. It's actually something that's kind of constantly been revisited around the development of economies and neoliberal economies that kind of keep economies going. If you kind of manage to make money out of the thing that you're wasting, like if you have a large waste source that is causing pollution and damage, if you can find new product streams through that, then you're also kind of re-establishing yourself and making yourself produce more profit, and therefore kind of supporting the continued development of the material that makes the waste in the first place. Because it's kind of like a continued growth that you're creating. And so there's many examples where the waste of destructive industries have gone on to produce more capital, more growth, but also maybe more waste themselves. And this partly kind of defends and reinstates the highly consumptive economies that produce these wastes in the first place. And that's not to say that we shouldn't use waste, because like, of course, you should think about how waste processing and management can be embodied in our communities, and it's important to think where waste can go and how they're integrated into our societies or our architectures, because ultimately what we eat, digest, and excrete like shapes the world we're in. But if intensive industries capitalize off waste and continue certain forms of production, like the use of waste can often reinstate a form of production, we're trying to think and question what kind of alternative production systems or alternative economies can happen in the shadow of using waste. So you can't design new materials without recognizing that new worlds occur in the shadow of these materials. A lot of kind of material histories and material cultures have taught us that. And so it's important to think about kind of what world outside of the material world that your material that you're making might create, like what kind of systems, economies, communities, and connections that might be built out of making these materials. And so the kind of systems that we're interested in building towards are those of kind of common good and collective ownership on the islands, and those that kind of take the funds and think about how these are arranged within communities and not accumulated in one place. And so this image is one of 5 bivalve mural designs that we're currently producing. Each contains around 300 tiles, and each is mirrored like 2 sides of a shell, which is why we call them bivalve murals. And so one of each of these designs is being sold into a public-facing art collection, and the other twin will be installed in a community space in Skye that we work closely with. And the funds raised from selling these murals are going towards the development of scaling up our production facility that will eventually, hopefully in the coming years, make these tiles available to specify within building projects and kind of be available in the local market to be put in homes and buildings throughout Scotland and beyond. And the development of this production facility is partly because it's allowing us to consider alternative economies to salmon farming, like I was speaking about at the beginning, and therefore arguing for the divestment of the salmon industry, because the salmon industry really takes hold in a place by arguing that they produce jobs, and that's like an obvious argument for having an industry. And so this is kind of considering how we can make jobs out of the wastes of some of these food systems we're thinking about. But the commercialization of these tiles and subsequent hopeful profits will also build towards a common good fund, which is kind of a community-managed fund of money where communities decide upon the revenue of their collective assets and where they can invest them and what they want to put them towards within the landscape and their environment. And so we see the material development as like an exciting way to think about how you can work through food waste and like return to some historic ways of making materials, but also an alternative way broadly of living within coastal regions that have become polluted and extracted from. And kind of, it's a way of us to try and think through and develop ideas of economic possibilities and so societal structures that kind of move beyond the destructive landscape that we're currently seeing. We've also become really interested in the aesthetics of waste cycles, and this is something that we're trying to think through at the moment. So the material cultures that we often see today, like contemporary materials or things that process different environments into a very consistent, flat kind of surface of continuous matte colours and like not much grain or grit, is a really specific kind of aesthetics, like the perfect kind of moulded cement concrete building that you might see anyway, aesthetics that they're aesthetics that like demonstrate huge, large scale processing and like material mulching and development. And it's a aesthetics that often makes you like very unaware of the environment that these materials are from. They kind of encourage you to forget all that and ignore the material flows that you're inevitably engaging with. And so we're trying to think how you kind of break through certain forms of like contemporary aesthetics within materials. And lots of biomaterials do this already. They kind of have embedded texture and they're allowed to shrink, they're allowed to breathe, they kind of let water run through them, they absorb certain things, they might crack, they might flex, they might break down, and they won't normally remain consistently the same. And terrazzo is kind of a typical material that you might see this in. So when you see the lumps of material in a surface, you're actually seeing like the geographies that it's all from. You get this in the stones and like ancient Italian terrazzo. You know that they're kind of marble and they're from a specific mountain, and that has that's kind of has worth in the surface because you can see the grain of that marble, and you can see it in like the grain of wood as well. You're aware that it's from like a naturally growing thing because it has those lines. And those textures are formed from specific landscapes, and they kind of refuse the lack of connection between contemporary materials and the environments that they're taken from. And so in the case of the tiles, you see shells and you see aquatic matter, you kind of see a tidal thing. You kind of become aware that an animal has built it itself from the sea. And the colours you see exist within the shell because they've been absorbed from the ocean, from certain minerals. And so you're reminded of the tidal zone, and when you see the shells, you're kind of receiving an environmental information. And then finally, this is just like a little update from our workshop this month, but we're currently thinking of new ways to kind of also move beyond burning the shells, but using high pressure techniques to think through geological processes and like biomineralization and how you can process the shell with pressure and away from heat, which is kind of the next stage of our research. And that's everything. Thank you.